Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel. On this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 24 hours. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And during this video we're going to discuss the Russian massive missile strike that took place during the previous 12 hours. During the previous night, the Russians attacked the city of Kyiv. Furthermore, during the previous 48 hours, the Russians managed to destroy several training grounds of the armed forces of Ukraine in the southern and the northeastern parts of Ukraine. During this video we're going to discuss the situation on the ground, because according to information we have, during the previous days the Ukrainians managed to restore control over several positions in the Sumy direction, and the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly in the Pokrovsk direction and in the Dnipropetrovsk direction. So let's start, and first let's talk about the massive missile and drone strike that took place during the previous night. According to information we have, during the previous night, the Russians carried out massive missile strike and drone strike in the central part of Ukraine. Mainly the Russians were attacking the Kyiv region. In this map we can see the possible roads, approximate roads of Russian attacks. As you can see, the Russians were using mainly the drones of type of Geranian. The Russians were attacking the city of Kyiv from the south, from the southeast, from the east and from the northeast. The independent sources reported that the Russians used up to 170 drones to attack Kyiv and Kyiv region. Furthermore, the Russians used up to 7 missiles of Iskander-K and Iskander-M types. The Ukrainian authorities made their own statements regarding the situation. According to them, the Russians used up to 368 drones and missiles altogether, but the Ukrainians are saying that they managed to bring down almost everything. The Ukrainians destroyed around 339 out of 352 drones, and the Ukrainians destroyed around 11 missiles out of the 15 missiles out of 11 missiles in total that the Russians used. But when talking about the real situation on the ground and the videos that we got during the previous nights, it seems that the Ukrainians haven't managed to destroy anything, because almost everything that was targeted by the Russians was destroyed as a result of missile or drone strike. In this video, for example, we can see the consequences of another wave of Russian attack. Here we can see a building that was completely destroyed, reduced to ruins, and we can see huge fire. The source reported that Ukrainians were using these facilities to build drones and probably some parts for missiles that Ukrainians were planning to use to attack deep inside of the territory of the Russian Federation. Furthermore, we have lots of videos where we can see how the drones and missiles were flying above the territory of Kyiv. We can see lots of explosions that took place in different parts of the capital of Ukraine. So once again, the Russians managed to deal significant damage. So these strikes that took place in the city of Kyiv and the city Oblast weren't the only strikes during the previous 48 hours. The Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation and several channels that has some affiliations with the Minister of Defense published lots of videos how the Russians managed to destroy several training grounds on the territory of Ukraine. So let's discuss these videos in details, and the first video took place in the area of the city of Sumy. In this video we can see how a Russian drone was flying above the territory of the southern part of the Sumy region, and here we can see how Russians managed to discover the warehouse or ammo depot of the armed forces of Ukraine, and then the Russians attacked this area with precise strike using the Iskander-K or Iskander-M missile. As a result of this attack we can see very heavy explosion, and then we can see a secondary detonation and another strike carried out by the Russians. So this episode took place into the south of the city of Sumy, and this is very important because I would like to remind you that Ukrainians carry out several counterattacks in the region of Sumy, and as a result of those counterattacks the Ukrainians managed to restore several positions lost during the first Russian wave of attack. So this attack on Ukraine rear is very important for the Russians. Another training ground was destroyed in the southern part of Ukraine. We're talking about the Kherson region. So let's take a look at this video. Here we can see the video with much better quality, and here we can see a real huge training ground of the armed forces of Ukraine, with soldiers, with vehicles, with positions, with air defense systems, with units, and of course once again with soldiers that most likely had some trainings probably to work with drones or missiles to attack deep inside of the territory of Russia. And when the Russians discovered this huge concentration of forces, they attacked this territory with, let's say, probably Tornado S missile with the cluster warhead. As a result of this attack, the Ukrainians suffered significant losses. They lost around 11 vehicles and up to 75 soldiers were killed or wounded. So this is the situation about missiles and drone strikes that took place during the previous several days. And now let's discuss the situation along the front line. And first we are going to talk about the northeastern part of Ukraine, about the Sumy direction. According to information we have, the Ukrainians during the previous days managed to regroup themselves to bring additional reinforcements and to carry out several counter-offensives. And as a result of those counter-attacks, the Ukrainians managed to improve their position significantly along the line of combat contact. Basically, the Ukrainians managed to restore complete control over the settlement of Andriivka, and as we discussed in the previous videos, the settlement of Andriivka is the part of the first defense layer. So something wrong is happening with the Russian forces in this area. First, we discussed that the Russians stopped their offensive operation completely, or were at least slowed down by the Ukrainians, and now we see that the Ukrainians are taking initiative in their hands, and the Ukrainians launched their own counter-offensive operation with the main purpose, most likely, to restore control over the entire Sumy Oblast. In this video, for example, we can see how Russians were attacking Ukrainians in the area of the village of Andriivka in different parts. Several episodes were geolocated, how Russians were attacking stormtroopers of the armored forces of Ukraine. One of the episodes took place in the southern part, another one in the central part, and furthermore the Ukrainian sources themselves published this video. We will not watch this video. Here we can see how Ukrainians managed to capture at least 12 Russian soldiers in the most northern part of the settlement. So based on these three videos, based on the report that was published by pro-Ukrainian resource Deep State, we adjusted the territory in the village of Andriivka completely in Ukraine's favor. Today several neutral mappers clarified the situation on the ground, and according to them, the Ukrainians managed to restore control over the village of Andriivka as well as over several tree lines and facilities to the south of Alexeyevka. So due to this situation, we expect that Ukrainians will continue their offensive operation further, and first they will attack in the direction of the settlement of Alexeyevka. So most likely the battle for this territory is going to start today or even maybe tomorrow. Once again, something strange is happening right now, and all these things tell us that maybe the Russians didn't plan to attack the city of Sumy itself, that was just attempts to distract Ukrainian attention and to keep as many as possible forces in this area. Meanwhile, the main Russian offensive operation take place, let's say, somewhere in the area of the city of Pokrovsk and the Pokrovsk agglomeration, or at least in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, or maybe the main Russian offensive take place in the area of the city of Constantinovka. So let's discuss these areas and in details, but before we go there, first let's talk about the southern Kupyansk direction, or the Liman area. According to information we have, the Russians during the previous 48 hours managed to improve their position significantly. For example, yesterday the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to secure the village of Petrovskaya. The village of Petrovskaya is the former title of the village by the name of Grekovka. The Ukrainians after 2014 renamed this village, and now they call this village as Grekovka. So based on this report of the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, we have adjusted the map and we have colored these territories in Russian favor. And we see that the Russians continue their offensive operation further in the northwestern direction, most likely with the purpose to get as close as possible to the settlement of Druzhlyubovka. Furthermore, according to several very reliable resources, the Russians managed to answer the village of Novy Mir. There are very heavy clashes for the settlements, for the territory of the settlement as well. And now we see that most likely the Russians are going to move further in the northern direction with the purpose to attack the settlement from Druzhlyubovka from the south. So we can see something like a pincers from the southern and the southeastern direction, and the main purpose is to cut this pocket and to maintain the lines between the Karpovka, or the village of Nitrius, and the settlements of Novoigorovka, Karamzinovka, and Novovodyana. So it seems that the Russians are planning to maintain their lines along this red line. This will allow them to shorten the distances and to have additional positions, additional foothold on the Ukrainian side of the river of Zherebets. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the area of the city of Constantinovka. The Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their position significantly to the south in the southern part of the Kyiv water reservoir. I would like to remind you that the Russians currently can produce the number of drones that they can't even use every single day. Some military experts are saying that, for example, the Russians can produce 400 drones per day and they can use just 390, just because they maybe sometimes don't have even targets to attack, or they don't know what to do with them, or basically they don't have enough of time to target another drone and to carry out successful attack. So that is why the Russians came to the conclusion that now they can use the grand drones along the line of combat contact. And during the previous days, we got lots of videos how the Russians were pummeling and reducing to ruins Ukrainian positions along N32 road and to the south of Kyiv reservoir with grand drones. They destroyed bridges, they destroyed logistic and many other strategical positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. And after this concentration of fire, the Russians carried out successful offensive operation. According to several mappers, and as a result of this offensive, the Russians managed to almost completely secure the village of Alexandra Kalinova, at least its southern, central and the eastern parts. And this is, as you can see, very important progress on the ground, because now we see that the Russians by this attack managed to cut supplies, cut everything through the west of the Kyiv pocket. So now the Russians control this area according to several sources, and the Ukrainians are no longer available to supply, support and evacuate their soldiers using this road to attack, because basically the Russians cut this road physically. Now the Ukrainians have just one option, to use 0524 road in the northern direction with the purpose to evacuate soldiers or bring additional forces, but we know that the Russian forces are very close to this road currently, and according to geolocations, the distance between edge Russian positions and this road is already less than 2 kilometers, which is already nothing. And obviously the Russians continue their offensive in this area, and they will try to get as close to the railways between the city of Novgorodsk and the settlement of Constantinovka. If the Russians are able to take this territory under complete control, this is going to be the beginning of a cauldron for Ukrainians in this area. As of now, it's just operational encirclement. The Ukrainians suffer losses during their evacuation process, a few hundred meters in the northwestern direction for the Russian forces, and this is going to become a cauldron. And obviously we're talking about several hundreds of Ukrainians or even several thousands of soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine on this area. So the cauldron was created obviously without any chances for Ukrainians to evacuate themselves from this area without huge losses. Furthermore, according to information we have, during the previous 48 hours, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly in the city of Chasiv Yar. And according to pro-Russian resources, by the morning of the 23rd of June of 2025, the Russians established control for more than over 90% of the settlement. The Ukrainians control just 10%, and that's it. And this is obviously already the latest and the last stage of the battle for this city. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Dnipropetrovsk direction. The Russians managed to improve their position significantly in this area. And on the 22nd of June of 2025, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to establish complete control over the settlement, over the village by the name of Perebudova. And the Russian sources published this video where we can see how exactly the Russians were taking this settlement under control, how the Russians were bombing and attacking this territory, and in the final part of the video, as usually, the Russians raised Russian flags in different parts of the settlement. Based on this video and based on the reports of different mappers, we have adjusted the village of Perebudova under complete Russian control. So this is the situation by the end of the 21st of June, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 23rd of June of 2025. The village was taken by the Russians, and the most important, the Russians managed to establish a strong foothold on the Ukrainian side of the river of Mokraya Yale. And obviously the Russians will continue now moving further in the western direction with the purpose to expand their positions and to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Mirnaya. At the same time, the Russians continue their offensive in the direction of the village of Yalta, in the direction of the settlement by the name of Zirka, and the Russians continue advancing through the three lines in the direction of the village by the name of Podubne. There are very heavy clashes along the entire line of combat contact. The Ukrainians suffered losses, and we see that the Ukrainians can't stabilize the situation. Once again, probably Russian offensive operation in the area of the city of Sumy was just a special operation that has main purpose to distract Ukrainian attention and to force Syrsk and Zelensky to keep as many as possible forces in this area, with the purpose not to allow the Russians to take the city of Sumy under their control. At the same time, the Russians launched probably a very big offensive operation in the area of Constantinovka and the Dnipropetrovsk direction, where the Ukrainians still haven't managed to do anything with the stabilization of the situation. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians improved their positions significantly in the area of the village of Shevchenka. During the previous days, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 20th of June of 2025, and this is approximately the moment when the Russians launched their offensive operation, and by the end of the 20th of June of 2025, the Russians managed to secure the southern part of the settlement and the southeastern part. So this is the beginning of offensive, the 20th of June. By the end of the 21st of June, the Russians managed to secure the south and the southeastern part. By the end of the 23rd of June, by the beginning of the 23rd of June, the Russians improved their positions, and currently Russian forces control more than 60% of the village of Shevchenka, and we believe that in the very near future this village will be taken under Russian control. When talking about the Zaporizhia direction, the most important updates are coming from the settlement of Malinovka. Several pro-Russian resources reported that today we're gonna get very probably good news when talking about the Russian side. They're saying that the Russian sources and the Russian pro-Russian people will get very good updates about the situation, the settlement of Mirno. We expect that the source reported that most likely the Russians either managed to secure the village of Malinovka completely or about to do this. And that's it for today, for the short video. Military summary channel reminds to become nobody violence to the world. Thank you for your watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.